when Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd by kneeling on his neck for 8 minutes. Many Americans asked, how could this have happened? And many of us vowed to never let it happen again. My name is Brian Brown, and this is my video series on structural racism in the United States for East Hampton Public Schools. Racism is our problem to solve. And in order to fix it, we've got to understand it. Today's lesson is on the destruction of Reconstruction. So let's get started. Reconstruction is the period immediately following the Civil War. Hopefully you know that there was a civil war in the United States in which several states decided to leave the Union. They said that they were no longer part of the United States, but that they were their own country called the Confederacy, or the Confederate States of America. The Union won the war, the Confederates were defeated, and it was President Abraham Lincoln's job to put the country back together. This is not an easy task. The people who had been running those states were in favor of secession, breaking off. They had committed sedition, right? And so how do you make it so that when these states rejoin the Union, you know that you will have a union, that the country will be together? And so that's the job of Reconstruction. Now, the Civil War was fought over slavery. The southern states left the Union because they were afraid that with Lincoln in power, that they would not be able to practice slavery in the future. All right? And so, since the Civil War was about slavery, Reconstruction has to be about the end of slavery. Reconstruction lasted from 1863 to 1877. Now you'll notice, for those of you who are scholars of the Civil War, that the Civil War wasn't over in 1863. So why do we start it there? Well, 1863 is the date of the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was a statement made by Lincoln which ended slavery in the Confederacy. Okay, this is important. It ended it in the Confederacy. These are all states that no longer were part of the United States. So, what's the deal? Well, in doing so, Lincoln made it very clear that that this war was going to be about slavery, and that when the war was over, the southern states would no longer be able to practice slavery. So this is an admirable thing that Lincoln does, of course, but it's an interesting point that there were states that were still in the Union who still had slavery. Now, why did Lincoln make a proclamation about slavery in states that he had no power over anymore, and not make a proclamation about slavery in the states that he did have power over? Well, the answer to this is that he knew that the Civil War was about slavery, and he feared that the states that were still practicing slavery, that were still part of the Union, would leave the Union and join the Confederacy so they too could practice slavery. Okay, all right, so when the Civil War ends, Lincoln's busy trying to put the country back together. He wanted it to happen very quickly. He made a pretty easy plan for Reconstruction. 10% of the eligible voting population had to swear allegiance to the Union, had to say, okay, yeah, we pledge allegiance to America. And also, they had to agree to the 13th Amendment. Now, the 13th Amendment actually ends slavery. Okay? Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. All right, now this whole line about except for punishment for a crime, this is where we're going. All right, this is a big part of our conversation. But for right now, let's just be happy that slavery is over. All right, and that's everywhere in the United States and any of the United States' territories, future colonies, things like that. So, the southern states, of course, they didn't want to end slavery, or at least the powerful white people in those states didn't want to. They wanted to be their own country. And so there was a military occupation of the South, all right? This was a war. And so United States troops stayed in the South to try to oversee the idea that Reconstruction would happen there, that they would follow Lincoln's orders. Now, let's not forget something pretty amazing just happened. Slavery just ended. There are 4 million people, human beings, who were being treated as property, who were being treated really as livestock in the South, who are now freed. Now, I don't want to skip over what I just said. So slavery, many people will point out that slavery is a common thing, that societies for all ages have had slavery throughout time and across space. And it's true. Human beings can be pretty awful. They always have had the capacity to be pretty awful and treat people as their property. Okay? But the type of slavery that we had in the United States was a different kind of slavery than most of the slavery throughout history, and it's what's called chattel slavery. So if someone was a slave in the Roman Empire, for example, they might be a slave for a period of time. They might be working off a debt, or it might be a certain number of years that they have to be someone's slave, but they might eventually get their freedom. All right. What really designates chattel slavery as different from slavery in other societies, though, is the idea of if I'm a slave under chattel slavery, my children will be born slaves. They'll live their lives as slaves, they'll die as slaves, and their children and their children. Okay? And so the dehumanizing effect, all right, of regular slavery is horrific, but the dehumanizing effect of chattel slavery is much more extreme. Much more extreme, because not only is a person right there seen as someone else's property and not a fellow human being who is equal to them in every way or any way, but also their children and their children's children. All right, and this leads to all sorts of atrocities, as far as rape and things like that go. And people being bred. I mean, it is horrific. The treatment of slaves in the United States is something that, there's a million stories. They're pretty horrible. Okay, so 13th Amendment, slavery ends. Amazing, great news. Okay, but what now? All right, people who were living on a slave plantation, obviously they're not going to stick around. They can leave. All right. In the past, if they tried to leave, all right, they would be beaten. They might be they might be injured in a way that prevents them from running away again. Have their hamstrings cut or something like that. People were whipped. People were treated horribly. Right. So when you can go, you go. And so people leave, and that's great, all right? And certainly people had all sorts of marketable skills, all right? African Americans, during the period of slavery, they built the wealth of the South. They built the wealth of the nation, really, all right? Because not only did they do all the hard work on these southern plantations and so on and so forth, but the whole American economy was tied up in the production of cotton and agricultural goods and so on and so forth. And it was all linked together. All right. So all of America, other than Black America, benefited from the labor, the free labor of Black Americans. Okay. So people had a ton of skills, but they didn't have any place to live. They didn't have a job. They didn't have any money. All right. And so the government set up what's called the Freedmen's Bureau, and the Freedmen's Bureau was in charge of trying to help people get, health care and education and jobs and stuff like that. In the really early days after the Civil War, U.S. Generals and stuff like that were in charge of certain areas, and they actually tried to set up some ways for people to work or to make a living. So for example, in Louisiana, they actually, like, the government took over a bunch of plantations and had people work on them and paid them for that labor. It wasn't nearly as great as that sounds, but it was a little better than slavery. Probably most famously, as far as during this Reconstruction era, General Sherman, a pretty infamous general for some of his tactics that he used in the Civil War. The area that he took over, his plan was to divide up land into 40-acre plots, give it to black families to farm, and so on and so forth, and also give assistance with equipment and mules to plow the fields and stuff like that. And that's where the phrase 40 acres and a mule comes from. You may have heard that phrase before. Spike Lee, the filmmaker, that's the name of his production company, 40 Acres and a Mule. It never came to pass. Disappointing, but true. Okay, so anyway, there was this process by which the federal government is trying to help these people who had been slaves for generations, right? They had been slaves in their parents and their grandparents and so on and so forth before them, to try to, survive now that they've been freed from slavery. Okay? Now, some other really amazing things happened during Reconstruction, some positive things. The 14th and 15th Amendments are passed. The 14th Amendment says, it's a long amendment, but the first part of it talks about the idea of everyone having equal protection under the law, and everyone, born in the United States being citizens and stuff like that. It gives citizenship, full citizenship, to black Americans who had been enslaved, who were now not enslaved and free. Okay? So that law is very, very important. 15th Amendment gives African American men the right to vote. And this is very important because not only can African American men vote and run for political office, but because jury pools for court trials and stuff like that are selected in the South out of voter registration. It also means that black men can serve on juries, which, since we're going to be talking about criminal justice, towards the end of this thing, that's an important thing for people to be able to see their peers on a jury. Now, the 15th Amendment is also very controversial, and I don't want to let this sort of moment go by, because, as I said, it gives black men the right to vote. Now, in federal elections at this point, women didn't have the right to vote. Women were not allowed to vote, is what I mean to say. All right, but it had not been written yet in the Constitution that the right to vote was something that was only protected for men. And in the 14th and in the 15th Amendments, it really uses that manhood suffrage for the first time. And this really was a tough moment, all right, in American politics, because the right to vote is very important, all right? But are we going to put in this language that for the first time in the Constitution it now says that only men can vote, all right? That's a pretty serious problem. It was divisive within the movement. Really great topic to check out if you want to look into it more. Okay? Anyway, so these are positives. And black men got elected to Congress. They got elected to the Senate, even a governorship for a brief period. True representation in government, pretty amazing situation, and people were voting. It was a pretty awesome time. All right, now, this course, of course, is about structural racism in the United States. It's about how people in power, white people in power, tried to maintain that power by making things hard for black people, and setting up more or less a system wherein black people could not reach equality. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. And this is really, slavery, that's obvious a case. People aren't even considered human beings, all right? People get freed, they're not slaves anymore, all right? Well, what do the white Southerners in power do to try to bring things back to the way they were? Okay, because they're not about to roll up their sleeves and get to work, all right? These plantation owners and stuff like that, they haven't lifted a finger, in generations, right? All the hard work is being done by African Americans, and they're not going to sacrifice their comfort, they're not going to sacrifice their wealth. In order to do that, they've got to fix this pretty fast. And by the way, of course, the economy of the South is absolutely destroyed as a result of this, okay? Because it depended upon the free labor of 4 million human beings who were not being treated as human beings, if I haven't made that clear, okay? So what did the South do to try to correct for this, to try to bring black people back down, all right, to keep them from gaining equality? Well, they passed a series of laws called black codes, all right? And black codes were a series of laws that were meant to curtail, to take away the new citizenship rights of African Americans. Now, I said there was a phrase in here that's really important, all right? Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, okay, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Okay, shout out to due process, all right? But this line, except as a punishment for a crime, all right? Slavery is still legal in the United States if it is as punishment for a crime. So, how does this level of structural racism work? Well, vagrancy laws. Okay? If you have been a slave your whole life, and your parents were slaves, and your grandparents were slaves, so on and so forth, all right, you don't have a place to live, you don't have any wealth, you don't have any money saved up at all right? And so vagrancy laws. Vagrancy laws, if you don't know, these are laws that are questionable anyway, but these are laws that basically, if you don't have a place to live, if you don't have any money in your pocket, that's a problem. That's illegal. So, and it's basically used to for people to push homeless people out of towns and stuff like that, which is not nice. But here's how it's used in this case. So police go around and they see black people and they say, "Where do you live?" And they have to answer, I don't live anywhere. I'm not a slave anymore, but I'm certainly not going back to the plantation. All right. But if people don't have an address, if people don't have any money, they're arrested. Once they're arrested and convicted of vagrancy, all right, they become part of what's known as the convict lease program. So the convict lease program took people who were in jail, who were convicts, been convicted of crimes, and they rented them out to plantation owners who then used them to work the fields. All right, and by law, you can force convicts to work. You can force people as a punishment for a crime to work. And so the Southern economy, as built upon slavery, is able to limp along because they've figured out how to re-enslave people using this loophole in the Constitution. All right, a couple quick more things about Reconstruction. So, as we know, Abraham Lincoln, he had a vision, excuse me, for Reconstruction, and then he's assassinated. When a president dies, their vice president takes over, and Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's vice president. Now, Andrew Johnson, note here that Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. Lincoln, as you probably know, was a Republican. Our concept of what a Republican and a Democrat is in 2020 is very, very different from what it was in 1865, to be clear. The priorities of the parties pretty different at the time. Anyway, why would a Republican have a Democrat as a vice president? Well, remember that in 1864, Lincoln had to run for re-election during a civil war. There was a civil war being fought in the United States. Lincoln had to run for re-election during that civil war. And so he was trying to do everything he could to keep the country together, to keep people, invested. And so he reached across the aisle and he said, okay, I'll bring on a Democrat. Johnson was also a Southerner. So he was really trying to be as unifying as he could as president during a civil war. Anyway, the deal with Johnson is that he was not a good president. He was a petty man. All right, I'm just going to say it. He was a petty man. The top leaders of the Confederacy, all right, these are guys that Lincoln had not yet articulated his plan for how these guys could come back into the Union. All right, he didn't want the leaders of the Confederacy to just be the new congressmen and senators in the government and governors and stuff like that. That didn't make sense. He did indicate that he was probably going to pardon them, but he hadn't come up with a plan yet. He was busy. Johnson came up with a plan that was petty. All right. Johnson was a Southerner. He was a Democrat, but he had a real chip on his shoulder about wealthy Southerners. Johnson actually came up poor. One of the few presidents we've had that actually wasn't already wealthy when he became president. Johnson had a chip on his shoulder, and basically his Reconstruction plan was, if you're a former Southern, Confederate leader, high up in the government, high up in the military and stuff like that, if you came and apologized to Johnson himself, you'd be forgiven and you could go back and join the government down south. Okay? And so here we have a guy who basically submarines the whole plans of putting the country back together and having it unified due to his own fragile ego. He's willing to sacrifice sort of the goals of unifying a country over his own fragile ego, and the idea that if somebody comes and kneels before him and says, gee, I'm really sorry, they can be part of the government again, even though they just led an insurrection against it. All right, so even though Johnson's Reconstruction is weaker, it's still Reconstruction. So how does Reconstruction end? If you remember, those dates said 1863 to 1877. So what happens in 1877? Well, in 1876, there's an election. This election is between Rutherford B. Hayes, who's a Republican, and Samuel Tilden, who is a Democrat. All right, and it's close. It's really, really close. In fact, the election is so close that there are several states that are coming back saying, disagreeing about who actually won the state. And so they're in this real crisis where, nobody knows who's won this election. There's just been a civil war. What we don't need is another explosion like this. And so the two parties get together and they make a deal. The Democrats, and just so you know, the entire South was Democratic. There weren't really there wasn't a Republican Party in the South. The South is all Democrat. There were Democrats in the North too, but the South is just straight Democrat. The Democratic Party says to Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, you can be president. We will back off, we'll let you be president. But, all right, you have to end Reconstruction. You have to pull your troops out of the southern states. You have to leave us alone and let the country just be the country again. The Republican Party agrees to this. Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the next president of the United States, all right, and it's the end of Reconstruction. And so here we have a situation where a political party, again, is willing to sort of sell out its ideals about having, the South reformed enough so that we can be one united country again, we see a party that throws its ideals out the window so that it can maintain political power and, be in charge of the country, hold on to the presidency. Okay, and so that is how the end of Reconstruction ends. This is known as the Compromise of 1877. Okay, and so what we've seen up until this point is the end of slavery. Hooray! Equality. Hooray! The right to vote. Hooray! Just for men. But with these successes and people being elected to political office and so on and so forth, which is great, we also see black codes, vagrancy laws, and the convict lease program, all right, whereby slavery is reestablished. Well, now with the Compromise of 1877, we just have, all that flies out the window, and this begins the era of Jim Crow. So in the next lesson, we're going to talk about Jim Crow, which is the period that most people think of the South, of deep segregation, lack of representation in government and stuff like that, and this stuff lasts until the 1960s. Okay? Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time.